Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the second episode in Hollywood Week on the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah. Today we have for you Mr. Marc Guggenheim. Mark, of course, is a very accomplished comic book writer, but he is also a Hollywood writer, producer. You may know him from his work in the Arrowverse, specifically Legends of Tomorrow and Arrow itself. But he's done all kinds of comic writing, things like The Flash, things like Amazing Spider-Man, Resurrection, which came out from Oni Press. Also Spider-Man and Wolverine more recently, Star Wars Jedi Knights, and has a new novel out in the past year, In Any Lifetime. So go pick that up. But for right now, let's listen to everything he has to say. This is Marc Guggenheim, Mr. Marc Guggenheim on the program. Mark, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you. Very excited to have you. We're going to kick you off with our patented first question, which is, how did you discover comics?
Okay, so I get asked this question not a lot, but with some regularity, and I always feel bad that I don't have a good answer to give because one of my earliest memories is sitting on the floor of my bedroom, flipping through the pages of a Superman comic. I was too young to read. I was just looking at the pictures. I don't know how I got the comic. I don't know who gave it to me. But it's one of my earliest memories. I did have these neighbors who lived across the street, these two brothers, who were older than me, and they had given me a lot of comic books. And my dad had bought me a lot of comic books. But who gave me that initial first comic? The only thing I know for certain is it wasn't my mother.
Do you remember when it sort of struck you that there were people that made these comic books? Because sometimes that comes a little bit later. You're just involved with the stories and the characters, and then you find out later people are making it, and you could actually do this at some point in your life.
Yeah, it's funny. I for me, the progression wasn't so much, oh, there are people who do this. It was, oh, there are people who do this who I'm a fan of. Like when you're reading Uncanny X-Men 139 for the first time, I was like, who's this Chris Claremont? Who's this John Byrne? Who are these guys? So that's really, like my sort of way into the sort of creator side of the fandom was less about realizing, oh, there are people who do this, and more about just associating people with the things I was loving.
Got it. And who were say you mentioned a few. Who were some of those people you initially figured out were doing this work?
Um, Marv Wolfman, George Perez, Frank Miller, Walt Simonson. I think, earlier, even before all those guys, I was aware of Kurt Swan's, like I could recognize Kurt Swan's artistic style. I could recognize Steve Ditko's style. I could recognize Jack Kirby's style, but I think I was just too young to kind of like really understand like, oh, these are actual people. I mean, I knew intellectually they were actual people, but I wasn't making that extra sort of cognitive step towards, oh, wait a second, these actual people have a name and a personality, and I just knew them by their art style.
Hmm, makes sense. I wanted to ask you about kind of the sequence of your career.
Sure.
And that's because I feel like I've seen some different things, right? I've seen the short legal career before
Yep.
going into TV and producing and writing and all of those things out in Hollywood. But I also see that you had an internship at Marvel. Is that correct? And did
I
that
did.
come previous to the legal
Yeah.
work?
So I actually interned at Marvel in the summer. I believe it was after my sophomore year. And it was fantastic, and I loved it. It was like the experience of a lifetime. And I always had this sort of creative sort of streak in me. and this creative impulse. At one point, like I thought I wanted to be an artist before I realized I'm nowhere close to being good enough to be an artist. And when I was intern at Marvel, I pitched them some stories. And I even colored an 8-page story in Marvel Comics Presents. But I think, I'm the oldest of three brothers, and I just don't think I had the balls to go into a creative field. The whole sort of cliche about the, Jewish parents wanting a son who's either a doctor or a lawyer is very, very accurate. And I was definitely not going to be a doctor. So, I headed towards law, but like that creative thing, just it wouldn't quite let go of me. Um, and it was, particularly vulnerable to the fact that the practice of law proved rather quickly, but I was in my fifth year when I ended up leaving, to be not what I thought I was signing up for. And, the system truly is broken. And I was only really mainly on the civil side of things as opposed to the criminal side of things. And that, the system is just horribly, horribly broken. And a lot of the things that I got into, the profession for, justice and fairness and all those high-minded things, didn't really have any real world application. And you know, that realization coincided with me continuing to sort of hone my craft as a writer and basically culminating in this sort of epiphany I had where I was like, you know what? If I'm going to do this, I should do it before I'm 30. I should do it before I have to commit to being a junior partner at my firm, which started in year 6, and I was in year 5. I should do this before I have a wife, 3 kids, and a mortgage. So it was just a confluence of events that made me go, okay, you know what? Now's the time to, if I'm going to do this, it's now or never.
It's interesting your sort of trajectory there because one, it semi mimics mine in that I don't think had the chutzpah to go after a creative career like right off the bat. There was just too much nagging in the back of my mind from my parents and upbringing about doing something practical. In fact,
Yeah,
they wanted me to go to law school. I resisted. But
good for
yeah,
you.
it's interesting because a lot of folks that we interview have that internship at Marvel or DC or wherever, and that's sort of the impetus. And they're either
Yeah,
they just get a job right after, or they go back saying like, okay, I want to get in this for good. So
yeah. Tom
interesting how
Brevoort,
you,
Dan Slott,
yeah.
it took me a little. I've always been a bit of a late bloomer, and it takes me a while to get around to things that are obvious to other people.
I'm curious once you started getting into writing and producing and the more creative endeavors, if there was anything from the 4 or 5 years as a lawyer that you kind of brought forward, either in your work style, in content, in sort of anything that sort of carried forward.
Y- Everything, honestly, like we don't have the kind of time it would take to sort of list all the different ways I use my legal career. But the truth is I use it every single day. And it has impacted my writing and it has, it very much impacted the way I produce. I always say like everyone should be a litigator for at least a year. Um, it's horrible and it's a miserable experience, but you learn so much and you learn all these transferable skills. And, one of my sort of secret weapons as a writer is that I'm very, very fast. And I credit that in large part to the fact that like, yeah, to write a 50-page brief in an evening or overnight, pulling an all-nighter is not unheard of, in the legal profession. So the whole idea of not being precious about your words, but like trusting your first instinct and getting them down and polishing them on the fly, that impacted my writing enormously. It was kind of ironic actually, because every year, like once or twice a year, the litigation department would evaluate the associates, and I'd get my evaluation, and it was always like you're the best writer in the department, but your prose is very purple. they would say. And this was actually the funny thing is that this was less I think, mistake on my part and more a difference of philosophy. I always, even when I was a lawyer, I always wrote for an audience. And the thing that most people don't know is you're not writing a brief for a judge, you're writing a brief for the judge's clerk. And they're the ones who's reading it, or at the very least giving the first read and sort of coloring the judge's perception of the case. And these clerks are overwhelmed, they're overworked, and they're bored as fuck. Why why wouldn't you make the brief pleasurable and interesting and evocative to read? So I that was one of the areas where I parted company philosophically with a couple of the partners I was working for.
Well, it sounds like you were ahead of your time because now the big buzzwords in business and law and everywhere is storytelling, right? They've come around to you have
Yes.
to tell a story, whether you're trying to convince a judge, you're trying to convince an investor, you're trying to convince whomever, that storytelling is the way to go. And
Yes.
it sounds like you hit upon that maybe a little too early for the trends for the moons to
I think
align.
I think I think all good trial attorneys, all good litigators understand, especially when it's a jury trial, understand that you are the person who wins is the one who tells the most compelling story.
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
um and I think that sort of philosophy has, yeah, kind of like spread out beyond just the realm of litigation, and now it's in other areas of the law and other areas of business. And it's like I said, it was a great experience. I wouldn't trade those years for anything.
So let's move into Hollywood,
Okay.
where you're currently at. Although you work in comics, you work in novels, you work everywhere. But obviously of interest to folks that follow our show and a lot of others is your work as an architect of the Arrowverse. So I wanted to bring it back a little bit to how you first met and started developing things with Greg Berlanti.
Yeah. So I'd been working on a show called Law and Order, and
Heard of
I
it?
was in the end of I was in the third year of my 3-year contract, and I told my agents, look, let's start renegotiating, to return to the show. But while we're doing that, let's put some, feelers out, but not just to go to another procedural. There's no point in going from Law and Order to another show like CSI or something. Let's look at, non-procedural shows. Let's look at character dramas. Let's try to get me out of the legal pigeonhole. And as it turned out, a friend of mine, Vanessa Taylor, who co-wrote The Shape of Water with Guillermo del Toro, told me about the show that she was working on with Greg Berlanti, and by the way, also speaking of comic books, Brad Meltzer. And it was a show called Jack and Bobby. And I love the pilot. It was an absolutely brilliant pilot that Greg and Vanessa wrote. And I met with Greg and hit it off with Greg, I think. But where we truly hit it off, and I think where we truly sort of started to bond, was just working in the writers' room on Jack and Bobby together. And it was very clear we shared a lot of the same sensibilities. And we both loved comics, but we also both loved legal shows, and we like the same movies and everything. So that's really where the collaboration, the partnership began. Jack and Bobby unfortunately got canceled after the first season, but Greg and I stayed in touch, and we kept, finding things to work on together.
Sounds pretty, easy so far and understandable. How did you guys hit upon adapting Green Arrow out of all characters to become a TV show? And probably you weren't thinking about this, but the cornerstone of a shared, TV universe.
Well, as was with most things in my collaborations with Greg, it started with Greg, and it started with Greg, having this idea for how to do, Green Arrow as a grounded, gritty, TV show. And Greg, he came to me with basically the show. It was like, Oliver Queen is someone who's suffering from PTSD. He comes back after 5 years on this island, and we're flashing back to the island. All these things. The challenge for us, honestly, was really making the show, but also making the show in the shadow of another project we had together, the Green Lantern movie, the critically acclaimed
Right.
Academy Award nominated Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern. So that, that experience taught us a lot, including don't let the project, leave your hands. Maintain maintain control of it, despite everything. So, we sort of created the circumstances for what became on the show Arrow, really out of a desire to avoid a lot of the pitfalls of the Green Lantern experience. And as far as it being, the cornerstone of a universe, I mean, I think Greg, like, secretly, like, always had, a hope of doing a Flash spin-off, but the whole idea that it would blossom into this, this crazy huge universe. I just remember when we were shooting Crisis on Earth X and we had like all the heroes on the Wave Rider, one of the crew members sent me a photo, which you've now seen all over the place, of like everyone, standing on, on the bridge of the Wave Rider. And I just texted it to Greg and I'm like, what have we wrought? And it, I think honestly, like, for me, the thing that I'm actually most proud of with the Arrowverse is the fact that we didn't try to set out to create a universe. I think that's everyone's mistake. I feel like you get the best universes, quite frankly, by starting small and building it brick by brick. And it's great to have like grand designs and everything, but um, never let those grand designs sort of get in the way of the nitty gritty of like, nope, you still have to do one good brick and then you've got to do another good brick. And that's hard. That's hard. It's hard to do a good television show. It's, doubly hard to do two good television shows, and so forth and so on. So I'm a big believer in, focus on the task at hand, and that task at hand is plenty hard, already all on its own.
I can imagine. And I have sort of plenty of other questions about, how this all kind of developed and blew up into what it ultimately became. But I also wanted to know when you started writing comics and where those two sort of threads intersected. Was it about this time? Was it before, after?
It was a little bit of a kind of a transition. Basically, what happened was, Greg and I, were working on a show called Eli Stone,
Hmm.
and I was under a deal at ABC Studios, which was producing the show. And by that point, I had been writing for DC and Marvel, for a few years. Um, and when Eli got canceled, I was like, the next show I work on, I like, it felt like by that point in my comic book career and my television career, I sort of was on these two lanes and these two streams that never connected, like, working in sort of character drama or procedurals in television and, genre stuff in comic books. And I sort of wanted to merge the two. And one could argue now that I've overcorrected, but it started off with, first working on a show called Flash Forward with David Goyer, then a show called No Ordinary Family, back again with Greg, and No Ordinary Family was a show about a family with superpowers. So it was like, okay, superpowers but no costumes, but we're inching closer and closer to comic book territory. And then, of course, we did Green Lantern and we did Arrow. And that was like, wow, okay, I really have crossed the streams there. Um, but it's I love it. I always say I work for 10-year-old me, and if 10-year-old me could be told that I've worked on like two superhero shows and done like worked on these crossovers with Superman in live action and Batwoman and adapting Crisis on Infinite Earths, he never would have believed it.
So you had started your comic book writing career at the same time, basically, as you were beginning to write and produce in television, or was there a sort of
No, there was
sequence to
so
that?
I kind of had to break into comic books twice. So the first time I got a comic book gig, it was a two-issue story for Aquaman at DC Comics.
Mhm.
And that was actually during Jack and Bobby, which is when I was working with Greg. And it was also my fifth year in the business. And I, had my outline and I go to sit down and to write, and I'm doing it out of my Jack and Bobby office. And I freeze and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how to write a comic book. Like, I just assumed, like, I don't even know what I was thinking. Fortunately, I was able to run down the hall, and there's Brad Meltzer right there, ready and able and thankfully willing to teach me how to write comic books. Um, and then Aquaman came out, and it was so well received that absolutely nothing happened, like at all. And about, I think it was a year later, yeah, it was a year later. I was working on CSI Miami, and my manager at the time set me up with someone at Marvel. And this was a time at Marvel when Kevin Smith was writing Daredevil, and there was this sort of like appetite. There was an increased appetite in at least in Marvel for writers from outside of comics.
Yep.
Particularly writers from Hollywood. And I was coming off of Law and Order in their minds, and I was working on CSI Miami. These were two very sexy credits at the time. And that is what hooked me up with Axel Alonso, who commissioned a 30-page Punisher story from me. Um, and from there, that led to the Wolverine Civil War tie-in. And once the Wolverine Civil War tie-in came out, the phone really started ringing. And that's when I, was working in comics, very, in a big way.
So you were pursuing it though,
Oh,
as
yeah.
far as when you were working on the Eli Stone and the former projects in Hollywood, you were also pursuing comics work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing is I always say that breaking into comics is so much harder than breaking into Hollywood. Because in Hollywood, at least in television, at least at the time I was doing it, there was something called staffing season. You can have an agent, you can have a manager, they can try to get you work. There's none of those on-ramps for writers in comics. There's no like portfolio review equivalent for writers. No one's sitting down to read your work. So the truth of the matter is the only way to break into comics, particularly like the big two, DC and Marvel, the only way to break into comics is to have either written independent comic books that have gotten people's attention, like, that's like what Brian Bendis did, or be like me or Kevin Smith or Joe Straczynski and write outside of comics, and then, be noticed that way. It's sort of like, I mean, I guess so. It's funny. I'm going to contradict myself. Um, I was saying like there is no such thing as portfolio review for writers in comics, but that's actually not true. It's just that the portfolio review isn't your portfolio; it's your body of work as a writer.
Yeah. Your
And
past work is the portfolio. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Would you consider your Flash run in 2008 your kind of breakout comics work?
That's a great question. I personally consider the Wolverine Civil War tie-in my breakout, but and the Flash, it's funny, at my perception, um, uh, of the Flash run is that it's much better remembered by those people who do remember it, and not everyone does. But my Flash run was much better remembered than the way it was received at the time.
Hmm.
Like I think, basically when we, when we were doing it, it didn't really feel like anyone was paying attention, and I think that slowly started to change over the course of the run, especially when we brought Tony Daniel on board as the artist. That was huge. And that was before Tony was huge. Um, but that really, really helped. And I don't know. I think I will do conventions and have fans come up to my table and they were like, it's the Flash run is the thing they're most complimentary of, which always tickles me. I had a blast with that run in large part because when Dan DiDio called me up with that assignment, I was immediately like into it because the pitch was, you know, Bart Allen's the Flash. Everyone hates Bart Allen as being the Flash. So take the book for like six or so issues, and know that we're going to cancel it, but at the end, kill off Bart. And this is going to be a weird comparison, but it always aligned with my pitch for Jar Jar Banks. Like if I was George Lucas, after episode one, I would basically spend episodes two and three making Jar Jar basically as cool as Han Solo and Boba Fett, and then kill him at the end. And be like, you wanted me to kill him, so I wish granted. That was sort of, I'm like with Bart, I felt I had the same opportunity, and it was a great deal of fun to work on that book.
Was did it hang in your mind? Because I'm cognizant of, when you're eventually working on Arrow and the Arrowverse, your run and maybe your affinity for Flash when it came time to sort of expand. Because I know you went from basically, I think, Arrow to Legends of Tomorrow, but Flash was the next show after Arrow. Is that correct?
Yes, but I actually didn't work on Flash.
Right.
So my sort of experience with Flash was I did my run on Flash with Bart, and then Michael Green and and Michael co-wrote Green Lantern with Greg and I.
Hmm.
Michael Green and I wrote a Flash movie for Greg to
Oh,
potentially
okay.
direct. Um, and truth be told, there were just like weird political things having to do with Andrew Kreisberg that prevented me from working on the Flash show. And I was totally fine with it. I think I ended up kind of like embracing the crossovers as like that was the thing that it was the thing I was most excited about. I grew up, I'm gonna date myself here, but like I grew up with the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman, and they did their annual crossovers that I absolutely loved, and that was one of the things and I had bonded about actually early on about our love for that show, those two shows. And I just ended up like diving headfirst into the crossovers, in part because, again, that 10-year-old boy in me just, absolutely loved the fact that we were doing this. But also, like, the producer in me really enjoyed the production challenge, the scheduling difficulties, the budget difficulties, all the things that go into crossing over these shows. And for better or for worse, I was the one who was kind of pitching increasing the degree of difficulty each year, and making, the crossovers what I call show agnostic, and so it wouldn't be like it wouldn't be an episode of Arrow, it would be a Crisis on Earth X episode 3 or whatever. And I kind of again I just loved that. Again, 10-year-old me was going, that'll be fun.
Right.
So that's sort of, I think I got way far afield of your
No,
question.
that's okay. But it sounds like Flash was somewhere in the ether, and therefore was easy to t- to make the next project, even though it wasn't your project coming off of
Yeah,
Arrow.
I think
It was more of a
definitely.
natural.
I mean, I think if you look at the Flash script that Michael and I wrote, there's a lot of DNA that transferred over to the Flash show for sure. Um, and I also, I hope I'm not talking out of school here, and hope I'm not being wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Flash is just Greg's favorite superhero. So I think that probably had more to do with it than anything.
Yeah. Um, so for when you're talking about characters like Arrow and the Flash and the characters that made up Legends of Tomorrow, how did you think about with you're steeped in comics. How did you think about the characters and the stories for the shows versus or influenced by, like, what is that balance
Um,
of getting to the stories for a TV show knowing all that you can draw on, but you maybe don't want to draw on some things. Like how do you make the distinguish between the two, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny. So when Greg first came to me with the idea for Arrow, my immediate answer, apart from this is awesome, was, oh, the two books that we should both reread are Longbow Hunters by Mike Grell
Mhm.
and uh, Green Arrow Year One by Andy Diggle and Jock. And in really less to be like, let's adapt these stories, because as you can tell, we obviously didn't, but more like this is the tone, Green Arrow Year One is, the way I sort of describe it, it was proof of concept for what became Lian Yu. It showed that you can get 5 years worth of story out of this, island. Um, the idea of actually adapting a story, it never really occurred to us. I can't really speak to like the Supergirl writers or the Flash writers, but it, the idea of adapting a story never really occurred to us until, um, quite frankly, Crisis on Earth. No, actually, that's not true. Invasion. When we did Invasion, it was like let's adapt the Bill Mantlo, Todd McFarlane miniseries.
Right.
Um, and again, I would say that that was a very loose adaptation. Obviously, we know we had the Dominators, but didn't have much else. But then when we did Crisis on Infinite Earths, that was like what I would probably consider the first true adaptation, even though obviously we had to take a lot of license to make it work in live action with our characters, the budgets of our shows and so forth.
Did Smallville play any role whatsoever, either something you wanted to pull forward from that version of Green Arrow, or just being like, we are just ignoring this, we're starting over with something different?
The answer is a very honest yes and no. So, from a writing perspective, we were like, we're absolutely starting over. This is brand new. This is a totally different, universe. At the same time, what I think a lot of people don't know is we inherited Smallville's Arrow, I should say, inherited Smallville's crew, their stages, I think maybe even their production offices, I forget. But so we inherited a lot of Smallville personnel
Hmm.
that definitely had an influence on the show. Like Glenn Winter, for example, who was the DP of Smallville and an occasional director of Smallville, also started out as Arrow's DP, also directed many episodes, directed the pilot of Supergirl, directed the pilot of Legends. So a lot of, DNA from Smallville came over into the shows. You know, the only other thing I can say is I really wanted to get Justin Hartley to be on Arrow, and we had a couple of different scenarios for how to make that work, especially since we had parallel universes and
Right.
everything.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it is just we could never hook it up. I honestly I've spoken to Justin. I don't even think his agents passed him along the offer, quite frankly. So uh, you know, uh, all that's Hollywood. That happens.
Yeah, I guess he was pretty busy with This Is Us, doing that
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
dramatic
I
thing.
definitely, for sure. I definitely. But the whole idea of like Justin and Steven Amell sharing the screen together,
Yeah,
that was an idea I could never quite shake out of my head, and it bums me that we didn't get to make that work.
would have been cool, but never say never. I
Never
mean,
say never,
multiverse is sort of
and
the
we,
hot,
we
the
did
hot
get
thing. So,
we did get Tom Welling back for Crisis on Infinite Earths,
right,
so
yeah, that was
and
cool.
that felt pretty darn good.
Um, I wanted to, before we move back into some comics work, I have to ask about Legends of Tomorrow. Um, First of all, kind of what went into the calculus of making that, or making that the third show? Because I mean, it's pretty linear from Green Arrow to Flash. But then it feels like a hard left turn into this motley crew of a team that has not formed in comics before and doing
Yeah.
something as original as you can do with it being still from, adapting previous characters.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So originally, Legends was going to be Hawkman and Hawkgirl, and I think our working title was the Hawks, which was a lame title, but it was a working title, so it didn't have to be
Sure.
good. And as we were working through that, we kind of discovered, that that show just it didn't have its own identity. The thing about Arrow that works about Arrow is it's completely different from Flash. And the thing that works about Flash is that it's completely different from Arrow. And that's, by the way, one of the things that made the crossovers fun.
Yeah.
Was like getting these two very tonally different shows and tonally different heroes, working together. But we couldn't quite find out like what was that thing, apart from being DC characters, what's the thing that made the Hawks a worthwhile show to do. And while we're like sort of struggling with this, we all kind of independently, and this includes, by the way, like the head of the studio, Peter Roth, and the head of the network, Mark Pedowitz, we all sort of slowly came to the realization that between the two shows, we have all these like characters who popped, who like, could field a team of heroes or, heroes in quotes. And the idea of doing a true ensemble. I mean, obviously, Flash and Arrow became ensembles, but the idea of doing a team show, where it was designed to be an ensemble from jump and not centered around one character or one hero, that was the thing that for us made it different. And, then of course, Legends itself, evolved as we went along, like, like it's funny. When I was in the editing room with Greg watching Glenn Winter's first cut of the Legends pilot, I remember at some point I turned to Greg and I'm like, we've got this whole thing wrong. We've been talking about we're doing our version of the Avengers, but the truth is we're really doing Guardians of the Galaxy. And it wasn't until season two that we were actually able to really embrace that. Because the thing is, when you do a network show, normally you have a pilot and you have a like mini hiatus between the pilot and the second episode. And during that hiatus, you're really able to make a lot of creative choices based upon what worked and what didn't work in the pilot that you've had a chance to now produce and post produce and screen. And we didn't have that with Legends because we went straight to series. So we were sort of like on our Avengers track for the entirety of season one with a couple of little, slight detours. But we could truly embrace our Guardians of the Galaxy in season two. And that I think is what allowed the show to become what the show, you know, not only ultimately became, but really always wanted to be.
Yeah, I mean, my next question, which you anticipated, was about the evolution of the show. Starting with a not completely, but mostly serious tone,
Yeah.
and then very much evolving into embracing, you know, m just huge ideas, absurdity to a certain extent, and really sort of like the anything can happen sort of comic book attitude that it became known for. And so it sounds like you found it was organic, but it was organic maybe after you had to get sort of the first season out of the way or out of your system before you can sort of move in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, like we were sort of committed to this tone and committed to this approach from the pilot, and we didn't really have an opportunity to do that sort of creative reset until we were in season two. And even that, I think if you look at season two, that itself is a fader switch. If you look between 201 and 223, or sorry, no, sorry, 201 and 216, episode 201 and episode 216, our season premiere, our season finale, like it gets zanier and zanier as it goes along.
Yeah.
Like there's episode like 208 or 209, which is Raiders of the Lost Art episode where, it's where George Lucas, the legends screw up and George Lucas doesn't become a filmmaker and
Right.
you know, and that was actually the episode where I was like, oh, okay, so either we found the show or we're all getting fired tomorrow. Like it was one or the other.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the episode where we really found the show. Because it was like it was the right to me it was the right mix of everything. It was the right mix of the comic book aspects and the outlandish aspects, and it played with time travel, I think, in a really clever way. And I feel like so much of that show, maybe more so than any other show I've ever worked on, is such a product of the collaboration between Phil Klemmer, the other showrunner, and I. Because I'm sort of the superhero guy. I bring the comic book sensibility, and Phil brings the comedic sensibility. And I think, finding that right balance between those two sensibilities, that's where the magic, I think really happened in the show. I don't think the show would have been the same if it was me doing it alone or Phil doing it alone. It really took the two of us and our I wouldn't say conflicting approaches, but not always synchronous approaches.
Mm, I get it. It also sounds like there was probably influences outside of comics that played a role. Like I immediately think of when I was watching this, like this is a new quantum leap, right? With sort of the trappings of superhero kind of adventure, but that's it had just has that kind of tone, um, and I thought that was very interesting.
No, I will say the thing, and this is true for a lot of shows, but I think it was especially true for the Arrowverse shows. The showrunners especially, but also the writers and even a lot of the directors, we really encouraged um, a leaning into our various influences. Like I said, the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman really informed the crossovers for me and Greg. A lot of times, in the Legends room, we were like, "Oh, this is our Back to the Future episode,"
Mm,
or "This is our such and such episode." Like, and we really like embrace the fact that, we're not doing this in a vacuum, and we're not doing this for the very first time. You know, we are, we are, it sounds pretentious. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. Let's be honest about that and embrace that. So, and I think it's one of the things that made all the shows, what they were.
Turning back to comics, you've done your fair share of larger, big two characters like the Flash. You were on Amazing Spider-Man at one point, on and on. But you've also done, create your own books, Resurrection for Oni, and some others. Do you have a preference necessarily for writing established characters versus new ones, or do you like to sort of do one for them, one for us, as they say in the TV
You
business?
know, I, it's so funny. Like I think my whole career, you sort of can look at as like, you know, I really enjoy kind of doing a little bit of everything. And I always say like the grass is greener on the other side, and the truth is I'm very lucky that I get to touch all the different pieces of grass. There's things I love about, create our own books. Particularly the Hollywood side of me really likes the fact that like I get to create something without studio or network interference. I'm not getting, Hollywood kind of notes when I do a create our own book. It feels like a much more pure bit of creative expression. At the same time, like I said, 10-year-old me, loves the fact that I'm writing Spider-Man and Wolverine right now. Loves the fact that I wrote Doctor Doom and I'm writing Mephisto, for Bring On the Bad Guys. Like, so I love them both, like, but for completely different reasons. And that's why I'm just always very fortunate and very grateful that I get those opportunities that I get to do creator own work. I would say like in terms of like I wish it was as organized as one for you, one for me. But it just isn't. Especially since also that kind of implies that the one for you is not something I'm passionate about. It's like,
Right, right.
I kind of like, I kind of just go a little I go kind of where the muse takes me, but also kind of what opportunities come up. Um, you know, Different creator owned books I've done have come about in different ways and at different times for different reasons. So it really like, it so varies. I wish there was a rhyme or reason to it, but it really, really isn't. It's very strange.
More of a one for me, one for me again.
They're all, yeah, I mean,
They're all for you.
fundamentally, they're all for me.
Yeah,
I'm because also, here's the thing, like very early on in my career when I did CSI Miami, I took that gig for the money. And because I just had a baby girl and you know, I went on work on that show and it was a total nightmare. It was a bad show with bad writing, run by a showrunner who, would get canceled today for the shit that she pulled. And ever since then I was like, I'm no longer taking a gig for the money. Um, and now I truly don't like I go I go where, like I said, the muse and the business take me. And what does 10-year-old Mark think of the gig?
that's an amazing position to be in. Do it,
I'm very
do what you want
fortunate.
to do.
I'm incredibly fortunate.
Yeah.
It's funny, like I recently took on a feature rewrite assignment, where I passed on it because I was like, I think I'd have to change this too much, in order to make it work for me. And they were like, okay, that's fine. But then they ultimately came back to me, and I'm going to be turning in the draft next week. And it's an interesting. It's funny. It's a lot like Legends, 209. Like it's either the best script I've ever written or the worst script I've ever written. But it was an exercise in like making it not mine, like from a possessory sort of sense, but really making it making the story work for me, in the hopes that if it works for me, it'll work for other people.
Right.
So we'll see. We'll find out. I turned in the
Yeah.
draft next week.
Well, either way, I mean, it seems like you've satisfied your goal for the
Oh,
project. Whether it becomes ultimately, I guess, embraced or not
yeah. At the
is
end of the
not up to you, I
day,
guess.
it's not. That's the thing. You learn, especially in Hollywood, you learn very early on, like, these are work for hire gigs, and you sort of you have to I mean, especially in features, you have to conceive and gestate and give birth to this child who's then going to be taken away from you. And you've got to be comfortable with that. You've got to be, you've got to be okay with that. So like at the end of the day, it's like, okay, I'm excited about this baby, even though I know I'm not going to be able to raise the baby.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions all around a project which was the adaptation of Arrow into a maxi series, 12 issues
Yes.
in 2012.
Yes.
One, was it, I guess, strange to take what was an adaptation of comics into television in some way, and then to take that television show and readapt it into comics? And
It,
then I'll get to the other question
yeah,
because it might get too
yeah, I think you're
complicated.
talking about Arrow season 2.5.
Right, yeah.
Which was it was a 12 issue series that was set in between, obviously, Arrow seasons 2 and 3. That was done while we were doing Arrow season 3. Um, so first of all, I love that project, in large part because I just love the fact that it exists. Like, like just like when we did Rise of the Paragons, which were the comic book crossovers with Crisis on Infinite Earths, that Marv Wolfman and I wrote. um, I just, it tickles me that this exists, that this is real. And because I want to say it's unprecedented. Like I can't really think of another show that's done that. Like, especially, I mean, done that by like the actual creative team behind the show,
Yeah.
like when does the showrunner of a show write a comic book tie-in to their show? I if it's happened, if someone else has done it, I apologize, but I think whether we were the first people to do it. And that was both wonderful and terrible. It was wonderful because it was cool, and I was very proud of the end product. It was terrible because it was like it was a lot of Arrow. Working in season 3, that was a lot of Arrow. It was also, by the way, that was the same time period where we were also developing, Legends and getting ready to launch Legends. So it was a lot of Arrowverse. But I love the fact that we did it. Again, to the point where a few years later, when we were doing Crisis on Infinite Earths, I no one came to me and said, "Hey, would you do this?" It was me going to DC saying it would be great to do a comic book tie-in. In large part because I just want to use a lot of the characters that I knew I couldn't get in live action. Um, but yeah, I love the fact that that stuff exists. Probably not the right answer or a satisfying answer.
I love it too. I think I just think it's such an interesting project, like how to and that sort of leads me into the other question, which was, and I'm sure you've gotten this before, but pertinent to this is, you know, writing comics versus writing TV. And I think especially for you, who may be the only or part of a small group who's doing it at the exact same time,
Yeah.
do you have is it do you have to turn off and turn on different parts of your brain when you're going from a TV script to a comic script? Are they
Yes.
similar in some way?
Well, they're similar insofar as the way I write is I see the story in my mind's eye. And I'm pretty much just taking down dictation. I'm seeing it like it's a movie, and I'm just writing down what I'm hearing the characters say. With comics, I have to make the cognitive shift of always remembering that there are, these have to be still images. So the
Mhm.
camera's not moving. The people aren't actually moving, even though they're in motion in an individual panel. It's static storytelling versus it's sequential storytelling versus, I forget what the opposite of sequential is, but it's active versus static.
Yes. Okay.
And and I do have, but like I've now like been, it's a lot of it's muscle memory at this point, and I've been writing television professionally for 25 years and comic books professionally for 20 years, and now that's just a light switch. I can go back and forth, really, really easily. I think also like my work in television helps my work in comics because I do think cinematically, I do think in terms of shots. And I think in terms of like, oh, this would be a wide shot, this would be a close up, go from here to here. A lot of the editorial choices that I make in an editing bay are very similar to the editorial choices I'm making in my head as I'm writing a comic book script. And making sure that those shots all work together in a coherent way. There's differences, but there's a lot of similarities, especially in terms of my process.
Yeah. I always find it interesting in the comics medium that it is less passive than taking in a moving image where everything is to a certain extent filled in for you. You're kind of pulling and pushing between what is being shown on the panel and what is not being shown on the panel and in between.
The other big difference is that, in television and film, you're always encouraged to show, not tell.
Yeah,
And in comics, you have all these devices, particularly like internal narration, and back in the day, thought balloons, where you could absolutely just tell all the time and not show
right.
anything. And, you know, and for me, it's like, I know that I've got those, I know I have in comics the license to tell more than show, but I still always try to, okay, how do I do this in a way where I'm showing and not telling? As much as I can. Sometimes it's hard because also like comic books are now 20 pages. And you know, telling a story in 20 pages, even a serialized story, I still want each individual issue to be a satisfying read for the reader. I want it to be a complete meal. And to do a complete meal in 20 pages, it's hard. I should say it's not without its challenges. And I like to kind of, embrace those challenges.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Before we, come to a conclusion here, you have a long bibliography, a lot of work. I can't cover everything, but I did want to give you the opportunity. I'd love, from your perspective, what do you, what and we may have mentioned them already, but what projects, what comic projects, would you put at the top of your own list that you've worked on? Either ones we mentioned, other ones we haven't. That whenever someone asks, what are the primo, Marc Guggenheim books? What would you say?
Well, I'll tell you, I always say like the youngest kid is always the cutest kid. I always tend to like my more recent stuff more than my old stuff. And the reason for that though is not just like they're the newest thing, but I I really feel like as a writer, I'm always getting better. And like for example, right now I'm writing Spider-Man and Wolverine, the book. Not Spider-Man and Wolverine, it's
Right.
Spider-Man and
Yes.
Wolverine.
Spider-Man and
Uh,
Wolverine. Ampersand.
and exactly, ampersand not an and. And those are characters that I wrote at the very beginning of my comic book career, or very close to the beginning of my comic book career. And the thing I love about working on this book is now is like, oh my God, in the intervening, call it 15 years, I've learned so much as a writer. I feel like I've grown so much as a writer. So to be able to return to these characters and like, with the tools I now feel that I possess that I didn't possess back when I first wrote them, that's very gratifying to me. Similarly, like I'm doing a Star Wars book right now called Star Wars Jedi Knights, where each issue is a done in one. And again, 20 pages. By the way, also Mark Panicia, the editor, set a challenge, threw a gauntlet down for me. He's like, yes, you've got 20 pages, but three of those pages should be splash pages. And I'm like, how the hell am I going to do that? And that book is honestly one of the things I'm most proud of. I tend to recommend the recent stuff, quite frankly, simply because I just think I'm a better writer today than I was yesterday.
Yeah, we've certainly heard that before, and it's always gratifying to hear that, creators like you are continuing to learn and strive to
Always.
be better every day. And so it's a totally well accepted answer, and enjoy your work on those as well. So good segue into what else you're working on now. What we can we look forward to in the future? You said Spider-Man, Wolverine, the Star Wars book, Jedi Knights. I see that you've dipped your toe in. I don't know how you have the time into novel writing. In Any Lifetime just came out, I believe. But you can feel free to re-describe any of those or tell us what else is going on.
Well, thanks very much for mentioning In Any Lifetime. I'm really, really, really proud of that book. And it's gotten a really great response. So there's that. It's funny. It's so funny, like talking about future stuff or stuff that's coming out because so much of what I'm working on is like below the waterline.
Mhm.
So honestly, like what I would say, this is less me pimping my newsletter and more trying to answer your question as best I can is I talk about the projects I'm working on currently, even though I can't talk about them, I give them code names in my semi-weekly newsletter, Legal Dispatch, which is it's on Substack. You can check it out. But I'm right now I'm working, like I said, I'm working on this feature rewrite. I'm working on a pilot for NBC. That's a procedural. I'm working on a animated show for Netflix that's incredibly cool. It's based on something you've heard of, but I'm not at liberty to say what it is. Um, and yeah, a few other things, sort of kicking around. A few more creator-owned books that are coming down the pipeline. Um, but yeah, there's always something going on. Um,
Just a few irons in the fire, just
yeah,
just the right amount.
I do like to keep busy, and I'm very
Yeah.
fortunate to get
Uh,
to.
Totally get it. Where can fans find you, follow you online? You mentioned your Substack newsletter, websites,
Um,
social media, things like that.
I'm on Instagram, and I'm active on Blue Sky. Um, My Twitter account is still active, but I honestly haven't been there since election day. Um, and I don't miss it, quite frankly. So yeah, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Substack. Those are the places to find me. Oh, and I also have a website, markguggenheim.com, where you can check out things. I've got sample scripts there. Some essays about writing. All sorts of fun little nuggets.
Put everything in the show notes. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time with me tonight. It was a great conversation. I feel like we, glanced over such a deep career, but maybe another time we can get back into it. So
This
thank
was
you
like the
again.
James Gunn Superman movie. Like you crammed 4 hours worth of story into 2 hours. You crammed, 25 years into 1 hour. So
I
well
did
done.
my absolute best. I was inspired. I was inspired by that. That was a lot of movie.
That was a
And I can't
lot
believe it
of
was
movie.
under 2 hours because
It's
yes,
it's basically a tesseract in cinematic form. Is really what it is. It's a TARDIS.
agreed,
Um,
agreed.
yeah.
So
Uh,
yeah, maybe a new temp. I dare say though that maybe not a lot of filmmakers can sort of pull off that high wire act because a lot of movies that have that much into it feel bloated.
That feel
Yeah,
overstuffed. Yeah, no,
exactly.
I agree. I'm like I don't want to see that to be the new template
Yes,
for any kind of movie, quite frankly. And we'll see. We'll see. Maybe he's invented the movie for the TikTok era, so who knows?
never know.
But I hope not.
All right, Mark, thank you again for being on the show. Everybody out there, thank you for viewing and for listening and for rating, reviewing, subscribing, supporting the show. And we'll see you next issue. And we're back. Hey, Mark, thanks for being on the show. As we say with so many guests, just scratch the surface of this man's career. He has so much going on, whether it's comics, whether it's novels, whether it is TV, a lot of irons in the fire, as we say. So, looking forward to everything else coming out from the mind of Marc Guggenheim. Everybody out there, thank you for listening and viewing this whole Hollywood week. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing this whole Hollywood week. We have another episode to close out the week coming up on Friday. It is with an actor who you may have seen in many different productions. So we'll see you then. Peace.